This is Invested in Climate with Jason Rissman. I see climate as the world's biggest, most diverse, most important movement in human history. Millions of people dedicate themselves every day to protecting the planet. This podcast shares conversations with advocates, entrepreneurs, investors, policy experts, and anyone else that can push our thinking about what's possible and what needs to happen to address climate change. If you have ideas for episodes or feedback, get in touch on LinkedIn. If you enjoy the show, please leave a rating on Apple or Spotify. I'm currently building a new venture. It's related to storytelling and how we engage all sorts of folks in meaningful climate action. If you have expertise in this area, big ideas, or examples of something that's really working, get in touch. Thanks for listening and for doing whatever it is you're doing to support climate progress. Okay, let's get started.
We really believe every single person on planet Earth has a role to play, whether it's in the way they farm, the way they fish, the way they forage, or the way they plan out how they're going to spend their money on their own lifestyles. And so if everyone's a possible change maker, there's a lot of engagement we need to do to realize that potential.
Hi, folks. Many experts today say we're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction, a relatively short period of time when a high percentage of biodiversity dies out. To be clear, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of species and an extinction event bigger than anything our planet has seen for over 65 million years when dinosaurs walked the Earth. A recent study in the journal Science looked at 30 years of research across hundreds of species and showed the close link between climate change and biodiversity loss. It projected that if we can achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, 1 in 50 species will go extinct by the end of the century. Meanwhile, if current emissions trends continue, mass extinction could claim as many as 1 in 3 species on Earth. Sorry to start with such sobering data, but the threat to biodiversity is not talked about enough, and the stakes need to be known. There is, of course, hope, and it lies with people like Brett Jenks. Brett is the CEO of a global conservation and climate change nonprofit called RARE. They've been around for 50 years, work in 60 different countries, and yet often are behind the scenes. RARE has helped save species and ecosystems, and through that work, they've learned that their approach can contribute to systemic change. For them, it all begins with understanding people and how to change our behavior. I spoke with Brett about his background, RARE's approach and impact, their conservation efforts, and how they're working upstream to change finance, policy, and culture. Despite the stakes and the difficult challenges we face, I found this conversation to actually be quite inspiring, and I certainly learned a ton from Brett. Hope you do as well. Enjoy. Brett, welcome to Invested in Climate. Great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me, Jason. I appreciate it.
New Year off to an okay start?
So far, interesting.
Yes, it has been. Lots to talk about today. You've been working in climate, biodiversity, and conservation for a long time. Let's start just by learning a bit about you. Give us a quick flyover of your background and what led you to the work that you're doing at RARE.
I had a midlife crisis at age 24. I was making TV commercials, and I just remember being on this one long shoot for American Express. We probably shot 7 days in a row, 15, 16-hour days, and I was completely burnt out, and so were all the older executives around me, twice my age. And I realized people are going to probably get these American Express cards whether or not we make these TV commercials. I need to find something with more meaning in my life. So I literally upped and paid $5,000 to volunteer in Costa Rica as an English teacher. The rest is history. I've really worked mostly in the global South ever since then. I'm really glad I made that call.
So you must have had a profound experience. Was it being that close to the power of the natural environment there or the work that was being done on the ground? What really tipped it for you?
I moved to Costa Rica as a volunteer, and I was placed with a family in rural Costa Rica in 1992. They had just suffered a major earthquake, the Limon earthquake, the year before. I was the school teacher, the English teacher in this rural town, this gorgeous, absolutely majestic place called La Suiza de Turrialba, because it looked like, if rainforest covered the Alps, it looked like the Alps. And the family was so generous and so grateful for me visiting and teaching that they and their 3 children slept in one room together. There were only 2 rooms in the house. And they gave me the other half of the house, which was a small room, as my bedroom. And there were 3 walls in the bedroom because the earthquake had wiped out much of the house and they had basically rebuilt it. And my blanket was a blanket that had been given to them by the Red Cross. And so from the very beginning, I was overwhelmed by the generosity of people, relatively poor people in Costa Rica, who were just so loving and generous and made me feel like the work that I was doing, however insignificant it felt like in my mind, was really important to them. And so from that moment, I think I developed a keen interest in repaying that debt and repaying a debt to the planet and the communities that inhabit it. And I think that's really driven much of my purpose ever since. Just answering the question, what can I do for others? What can I do for the planet? How can I work with creative and grateful people to make a difference?
That's fascinating. I actually had a similar experience early in my 20s in Nicaragua. Won't go into it, but perhaps we are in some ways switching from advertising American Express to advertising, doing great work in Central America and working with people there. Brett, let's start with some of the basics about RARE. Give us an understanding of what RARE is and the major issues that it works on to address today.
RARE is a terrific little organization. We like to say we're the best environmental organization you've never heard of. We have a distinctly human approach. Everything we do is about people. We like to say that if you want to save all the species on planet Earth, there's really only one species you really need to understand, and that's we the humans. Every environmental problem is the result of human behavior, whether it's the behavior we exhibit when we make policy or spend money or design cities or design homes or the way we feed ourselves and the way we transport ourselves. But humans, now that there are 8 billion of us, we can conclude that we are a very effective species, at least at expanding our own population, which in the animal kingdom is the definition of success, but that we have outstripped our ability to manage, govern the natural resources from which we were born and on which we depend. And so at RARE, we spend a lot of time thinking about our mission, which is how do you inspire change so people and nature thrive? How does change come about? And so to answer that question, we've invested a lot of time and energy in learning more about human nature and leveraging the insights from behavioral economics, social psychology, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, the decision sciences. So we created a Center for Behavior in the Environment. It's the first of its kind in our space, with this recognition that if we're going to address nature's challenges and if we're going to preserve a stable climate for humanity and others, that we need to really understand how to shift our lifestyles and how to shift our habits and behaviors so that we can continue to succeed as a species, because that's not a given.
Brett, let's zoom in and start with your conservation work. And when we first spoke, you said something that I've actually never heard someone say before, and that is that you've helped save species. It's a powerful statement and such a profound and hopefully lasting contribution. Tell us about RARE's approach to conservation and the impact that you've had on at-risk species.
So one of the biggest challenges facing an endangered species is that most people don't know it exists in the first place. And if it's endangered, there probably aren't that many of them left. And so the question is, at what point do we recognize we're losing something? And then once we know that, what do we do with that knowledge? My favorite story about saving a species starts back in St. Lucia in the early 1980s, when a young college student at London Polytechnic did a term paper on the St. Lucian parrot, Amazon versicolor. At the time, there were only about 100 left in the wild, maybe 50 breeding pairs. And World Wildlife Fund and the IUCN had declared that this, quote, this species will not escape oblivion by the year 2000. So it was already being written off. And of course, this naive young college student wrote a paper that said, well, we could actually probably save that species. What if we created a park to save its habitat? What if we created fines and jail sentences that would put poachers in jail because it was becoming so endangered and it was a beautiful bird and recognized by bird collectors as just a work of art, that there was a black market as the numbers dwindled a black market developed and a poor St. Lucian could get $2,500 from the right buyer, which was a couple years worth of earnings at the time. So there was a real threat and it was growing. And so he wrote a paper that said, let's create a park, let's create legislation that will imprison all the poachers, and then maybe we'll create ecotourism so people will go to travel to see this bird. Unbeknownst to him, this sort of is a testament to the power of your individual actions in many ways, but unbeknownst to him, his professor sent the paper to the head of forestry, Gabriel Charles, in St. Lucia. And a month later, Paul received a note from the head of forestry that basically said, okay, smart guy, when you graduate college, why don't you come on down? We'll give you the equivalent of an internship and you can get to work. Turns out he took him up on the offer. He graduated London Polytechnic. He moved to St. Lucia. And then he realized no one in St. Lucia had ever heard of this bird. And so started his journey as a conservationist, trying to figure out what does it take to get everyone in this island of 160,000 people to understand that their island is home to this gorgeous parrot that is found literally nowhere else on Earth. It's so special that people will pay thousands of dollars to put it in a cage in Europe. And he looked around and saw how conservationists were doing communications, and generally they were leading with science and jargon, and generally there wasn't much to their campaigns. And he looked around and found that people were selling cigarettes quite effectively, even though it said on the package it would kill you. And that people were able to sell back then perfume to very beautiful people to lather all over them, not knowing that it was made of whale blubber and pheromones and other sort of disgusting ingredients. And so he realized he needed to get really good at marketing really quickly. And then because St. Lucia was becoming newly independent, it had been traded 14 times back and forth between France and England. It was about to become independent. And he thought, maybe this is the moment to create a symbol of pride and independence. And so he ran a campaign to have it elected as a national species. Lo and behold, many years later, it's fair to say this is one of the great case studies in species conservation. The St. Lucian parrot is now the symbol of the newly independent country of St. Lucia. It's on the passport. Every corporation worth its salt has appropriated the symbol to sell pride in the country. And Paul was given citizenship to thank him for his work. So it's just a great example of how instilling pride, giving people a sense of what's special about their place, and then being tenacious and creative is what you can accomplish. And so much of Rare's history really was built with that inciting moment. That's a founding story, even though Rare existed beforehand.
Thank you for that. Let's talk about how Rare's work has evolved. And I know that your conservation work covers not just at-risk species, but also natural environments, including marine reserves and millions of acres of seas. There's a lot of fantastic organizations doing conservation work, deriving from that founding story that you just shared. Curious, what makes Rare unique today? And since you've been doing this work for so long, how has your approach evolved to address the challenges that we're facing today, as well as the needs that you see for the future?
It's a big question, but it's a good one. So I think it's fair to say that from St. Lucia, we asked ourselves, well, where else can we repeat this success? And so we helped Paul replicate that program on his neighboring St. Vincent, and then Dominica, then Anguilla, and then Montserrat. And eventually we ran out of Caribbean islands, and Paul was flying halfway around the world to the Pacific Islands, where other organizations has said, we have endemic species here in Palau, in Kozrai, Yap, Rota, the Federated States of Micronesia. And so Paul commuted essentially to the Pacific from the Caribbean. At one point, he was the most frequent flyer on American Airlines in the Caribbean 4 years running. Of course, in hindsight, that's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, but regardless, we did a lot of really great work, one postage stamp size project at a time, replicating it like Johnny Appleseed all over the world. And then we asked ourselves, well, if we know how to essentially inspire change, and if we know how to identify and empower and support the local leaders who have the capacity to make big change, what are the globally significant problems that we could help address with a small organization and a small group of committed people that would have an outsized impact? And so after some analysis, we decided that we should consider focusing on coastal habitat, coastal fisheries. For 30 years before we started this program, most of the money that went into ocean conservation went into creating big marine protected areas far away from people. Because if you could get away from people, you could get away from the threats. And so it was, relatively speaking, and not to diminish the work of some ocean conservation heroes, but relatively speaking, it's way easier to create a park if there's no people around. What we realized by bringing in a bunch of scientists and studying the coasts of the developing tropics, the global south, was that most of the known marine biodiversity is found within 12 miles of the beach. Most people sitting on a coastline, drinking a cocktail, watching a sunset on vacation, have no idea that most of the damage that's done to the ocean is done within their eye shot during that scene. 85% of marine biodiversity, all the coral reefs, all the seagrass beds, all the mangroves, the great diversity of species of fish, mostly are found, probably there's a bias because that's easier water to get to, but within those roughly 12 nautical miles. And yet, we realized 10 years ago that of global philanthropy for the ocean, less than 10% of the money was going to those coastal communities. And so we asked ourselves, could we build pride like we did in St. Lucia in the richness of the local coral reefs and mangroves and seagrass beds that 1 billion people depend on every day in the global south for their number one supply of animal protein, for all future ecotourism development, for 250 million jobs. So critically important place, very little philanthropy, and a disaggregated multi-local challenge, meaning you can't just pass a law at the federal level in Indonesia or Mozambique or Brazil or the Philippines and expect it to actually matter in a remote, isolated island community. So it had to be local. And so, disregarding that long preamble, we set out to do what we know how to do, which is find local champions, support them, help them in building local movements that empower people to manage their own natural resources, and that let them learn from bright spots in other parts of the world so that they can build on success elsewhere to create and forge their own sustainable futures. And the end result is a new program called Fish Forever, new in historical terms. It's over 10 years old now. But we've gone from a pilot in 3 communities to test out this idea to now there are 2,000 communities in 9 countries readily adopting and improving this approach. And it's become arguably the largest coastal fishery recovery program supported by philanthropy in the world. Hundreds of thousands of fishers are now fishing sustainably, legally, carrying a card that certifies them as such. They're managing their own local waters. They're protecting local parks that they've created. They're enforcing their own rules and regulations. In short, it gives us hope that when empowered, when supported suitably, people really can not only make change, but sustain it and own it long term. At that point, having now launched a program that's been replicated in 2,000 communities, the next question was, after we had built the Center for Behavior and the Environment, to get to your final question, Jason, it was, so now what behaviors matter most? What should we think? If we can comfortably partner with some of the world's poorest fisher folk and then some of the world's poorest farmers, and we can help them rejuvenate their reefs or rejuvenate their soil, there's hope for the world's poorest, most climate vulnerable people. But what about the root cause? What about the greenhouse gas emissions and where are they coming from? And as a behavior change organization, we became captivated by the idea that we couldn't really see anyone else working to change the behavior, the lifestyles of the world's wealthiest people. So we did another analysis to start a new program, and we found essentially 10% of Americans produce 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions. That's because these 10% own more cars, own more homes, use more energy, fly more, tend to eat diets that are richer in meat, and therefore have greater repercussions, their diets, for land use. And so we realized that if 10% of Americans, the wealthiest 10%, could adopt a plant-rich diet, could drive electric vehicles instead of internal combustion engines, could charge them with rooftop solar, and could invest $30 a month in nature, in tree planting or carbon sequestration via nature, we would get the US pretty quickly back on track to hitting our targets under the Paris Agreement. And yet at that time, it was anathema to environmental organizations to talk about behavior for several reasons. One, it seemed like too far of a leap to think that people can change, because that hasn't been the specialty of environmentalists, most of whom have studied science or species or ecosystems, not human nature. And furthermore, human behavior change was considered, and proposing that that was a solution to climate change was anathema, because it had been essentially part of a campaign of the fossil fuel industry to convince the average person, much like recycling did, that we, the corporations, aren't responsible, you, the people, are. So make sure if you recycle, they won't blame the litter in the streets on us. Despite all of those concerns, and there's many more, we forged ahead. And so now I would say today, RARE has evolved to a point where, despite how confusing it sometimes is to people outside us, or people who've known us a long time and know more about our history than our present, we really believe every single person on planet Earth has a role to play, whether it's in the way they farm, the way they fish, the way they forage, or the way they plan out how they're going to spend their money on their own lifestyles. And so if everyone's a possible change maker, there's a lot of engagement we need to do to realize that potential.
Brett, thank you for sharing some of the scale of your work, as well as the massive opportunity that's there. There's a lot of coverage of global frameworks and structures for addressing climate change. Most people who pay attention to the news, for instance, have heard of the Paris Accords or maybe the IPCC reports on climate. There's also constant coverage of the really inconsistent investor, government, and corporate commitment to cutting emissions and reducing greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. There's not nearly as much coverage of nature and the global efforts to protect it. The 30 by 30 framework, for instance, isn't all that well known. So, can you help us understand the state of global action for conservation and biodiversity? Is there a globally coordinated effort? How has it been evolving, and why does it not get the attention of carbon when healthy oceans, forests, and diverse ecosystems really are crucial for our survival?
In short, yes, there is a coordinated global effort to save nature on planet Earth. We've agreed, hundreds of countries have agreed and signed on to a protocol that essentially and a commitment that calls for protecting 30% of our land and 30% of our ocean for the benefit of all living species on planet Earth. We're nowhere near hitting those targets globally, and the goal is to hit them by 2030. It's unlikely we'll actually hit those targets. I'm sure I'll be pilloried if anybody listens to this for saying it, at least among my peers. It's unlikely, but it's a really important goal. If we get there by 2040, it would be a monumental victory. Setting a goal for 2030 makes a lot of sense. The problem, and there are two, is there's not enough money, and there's certainly not enough recognition of the value of nature. The bottom line is, conservationists tend to talk about nature as biodiversity. Well, the average person, and whether they're in 6th grade or 8th grade, or they've graduated college, doesn't really know what biodiversity is. And it's simply the diversity of life on Earth. And why does it matter? Well, because without over-explaining, every single species provides its own insurance policy. And every single species depends on other species to stay alive, to be alive, whether it's because they get nutrients from another species, or because they eat another species, or because they get shade from another species, or water from another species, or what have you. But despite our rugged individualism, at least here in the West, and especially in the United States, besides our sense that we are wholly self-reliant and independent, we are foolish to even suggest that deep down, we need to understand humanity has been around a very short period of time, and that we evolved from the landscape that we see around us. We're just one other species that happens to have been incredibly successful. You don't have to go back very far to have billions of years of planet Earth with no human beings on it. We're a very recent phenomenon. And so our economy, our culture, our lifestyles, in some cases, our emotions, our social interactions, our lives depend on nature. Climate change has become such a better understood issue because in many ways it's existential. If we don't maintain a stable climate, it's very clear we put in peril our own existence over the next several thousand years, if not sooner. The thing about biodiversity is we understand so little about it. When I say we, I mean the layperson. The average person understands so little about nature that most folks today don't even know where their food comes from, how a tomato is grown, where an ear of corn begins, what you need to do to soil to tend the garden, where a flank steak comes from, where a pork chop comes from. If you ask the average person, they would say, well, from the supermarket. And yet, if we truly understood that eating a hamburger today that happens to come from the Brazilian rainforest led to the destruction of the rainforest, the disenfranchisement of indigenous people when Ladino families took over that land after their invasion, that the greenhouse gas emissions will cost lives as a result of felling those trees, that people will suffer, that landscapes will suffer, and that we are unleashing over time intractable forces that we don't even understand that can reach tipping points that will eventually flip us over into the planet that we can look up at in the night sky and see. Mars is uninhabitable, despite our greatest of intentions. I don't know why anybody would fantasize about living on Mars. You'd be just as well off living at the bottom of the sea in a bubble, because that's how we will inhabit Mars. Venus is 100 times worse. Venus at one time may have looked like Earth, but look at what happens with runaway greenhouse gases. Not to get too far away from the elegant simplicity of a virtual conversation in a podcast, but the biggest problem we have on planet Earth is a lack of understanding of human beings, of just how generous the Earth has been in allowing us to be here and enabling us to succeed. And we are incurring right now and expanding a debt that may never be repaid. And the cost will be jeopardizing the ongoing evolution of life on planet Earth. So the biggest problem facing 30 by 30 is a lack of recognition of humanity, of just how important nature is. Nature isn't just that beautiful stuff you see when you get lucky enough to go have a walk in the woods. It's the air you're breathing. It's the table you're sitting on. It's whatever your last meal was. It's the water you're drinking. And without those intact ecosystems, none of that's going to continue giving to you, no matter how much you spend harvesting. That's our biggest problem.
Brett, let's move upstream and focus on other areas where you're working at a more systemic level: policy, innovative finance, and culture. Seemingly, the fight can't just be species by species or ecosystem by ecosystem. We need systemic change, and you're working on that in several ways. Let's start with finance. You're working to connect the formal financial sector to conservation efforts. Investors, of course, seek returns. How are you engaging investors and the financial system to support frontline communities and ecosystems in a way that works for everyone?
About 3% of philanthropy in the United States goes to the environment. About 50% goes to religious groups. Given that philanthropy is dwarfed by government spending, and that government spending is dwarfed by the capital markets, once you know how to make change, once you know how to save a species or save a habitat or shift a culture to be more sustainable, the question is how to scale. And one of the limiting factors is money. So if you're going to scale a conservation solution, you need to think about leveraging philanthropy to bring in government funding, and leveraging government funding and maybe risk insurance or risk pools or capacity building investments to be able to bring in private capital. So I'll give you an example of what that looks like. In a place like Indonesia or the Philippines, we spent 10 years working with local communities to reform coastal fisheries with the theory that if we can improve governance and we can improve the sustainability of the fishery, then it would actually be responsible to bring more private capital to expand the success for local people and the businesses that are buying fish from the fisher folk and processing it and exporting it, bringing it to market. So we created something called the Malloy Fund. And the idea was to blend certain kinds of capital in a fund. So we put in some philanthropy. We put in a government credit guarantee from the US State Department. We had a European government agency put in some capital. The Global Environment Facility, which is part of the World Bank, put in capital. Some of it was seeking returns. Some of it sought no returns. And then based on the cushion that was created with that concessionary capital, we were able to raise some additional capital from impact investors, investors who said, I could probably put this money in the S&P 500 and get a better return. But as long as I can get my money back plus some return, I like the idea of investing with Rare in these small-scale fisheries in Indonesia. Because if that works, and our initial investment was $23 million, maybe others will crowd in capital. We can de-risk this market, and eventually we can not only have philanthropic and government-supported improved fisheries, but the capital markets can be brought to bear, and then we can scale up this solution. So that was step one. We're now 7 years into that process. We're in the harvest phase of that fund, and so far, so good. We're hoping in the next 3 years to return all of the capital to all of the investors, and in the process to have helped make them a profit while also benefiting thousands of local fisher folk and hundreds of thousands of hectares, if not more, of habitat. Next phase was to look at programmatically, how do we scale the Fish Forever program? By the way, a very happy turn of events for that original Malloy Fund. The team that built the Malloy Fund, we spun out of Rare. They've now been hired by Pegasus Capital in New York to manage a United Nations global fund for coral reefs. So the little team that we built at Rare is now managing the Malloy Fund, but also managing a $150 million global fund for coral reefs. So point being, we've already succeeded with phase two, and we got lucky with replicating and expanding the concept. The question for conservation organizations that live from philanthropy and government funding is ultimately, how do you scale a solution? Generally, you don't scale by scaling the number of donors who fund it. Generally, you scale by eventually handing over a program to a government agency that, because of its tax base, has a lot more money to be able to bring to bear. And so that's been our North Star for the last several years. This year in the fall, during Climate Week in New York, we announced the world's first impact bond for coastal fisheries. So basically, we have a group loaning money, and then we have a group paying for outcomes, meaning if the program succeeds in creating the protected areas and in seeing eventually fish recovery, there's a group of outcome buyers who will repay those investors plus a set of percentage points based on performance, so that we are simulating what a bond would look like to pay for coastal habitat conservation and coastal fishery recovery. What's nice about this is moving from philanthropy to government support, and then eventually to the private markets. So we call that innovative finance, because we're basically using the methods that you would use when eventually the Washington Commanders get a stadium in Washington, D.C. that will probably be funded by a mix of capital. Philanthropy will be a small part of it. Government funding will be a small part of it, and private capital, hopefully, will be a big chunk of it. That's public-private partnerships like that are how we're going to fund public goods that benefit all of the people who invest and a whole host of people who don't have to.
Well, really exciting, definitely innovative. And, I think you've well outlined the power and potential of blended finance. You're also working on policy. Here in the US, conservation isn't exactly at the top of the new administration's agenda. Not sure if it's in their vocabulary at all. What's your strategy for policy in this new era?
RARE's been very successful in recent years working under the first Trump administration, working under the Duterte administration in the Philippines, working under the Bolsonaro administration in Brazil, mostly because, I don't mean to sound cheeky, we don't really work at the federal level because all of our work has tended to focus on remote rural areas. In some ways, we're counter-cyclical in that we tend to thrive when what happens locally matters most. And so what does policy work look like for us right now? Going back to that fisheries program, just because it's a great example of one community influencing another, and then suddenly you end up with thousands of communities, eventually in dozens of countries, really doing the right thing. We now have a network of mayors, and there's more than 120 of them, and we're headed to 500. It's called Coastal 500. And they have not only signed up to embrace a partnership with RARE and to partner with us to reform coastal fishery management and create protected areas and focus on blue carbon and mangroves and seagrass beds, but they're also doing it in a coordinated fashion where a municipal ordinance, essentially a local law in one community in the Philippines, in one municipality, can basically be dusted off and with a search and replace function be put into law in a neighboring community. So the way we're thinking about policy is replicating successful policies that are the culmination of grassroots engagement and community-led conservation that ends up being more scalable, because if the community's on board and the local officials are on board, who at the federal level is going to want to take that away? And so it also makes it more enduring. That's generally how we think about policy.
Let's move to culture. Given the urgency of protecting nature amidst so much risk, why focus on something as potentially slow and nebulous as culture change?
Because no one else does, and because ultimately it may be the most powerful force for humanity. We've worked in 60 countries intensively over the last 40 years. We've partnered with people in over 100 countries. Humans, despite our appearances, tend to be pretty similar everywhere on Earth. We are one species, we are one primate, and we are incredibly social. We think of ourselves as rational beings. If I were doing the PowerPoint, I'd put up a picture of Spock spreading his Vulcan hands. And there was a time when economists all believed that humans were logical beings walking around Earth with calculators, constantly calculating how to get the greatest benefit economically from every decision that we make. And all you need to do is think about it and sit on a bus or walk around your neighborhood or walk down the street and just look for how illogical some of the things that we do are. Think of the clothes we wear. Think of the ways we paint our faces. Think of the screaming and yelling and dancing we do. And think of how we spend our money. And ask yourself, how logical are we as a species? And so ultimately, there's lots, starting about 10 or 15 years ago, psychologists started winning Nobel Prizes for economics because they were able to demonstrate how predictably irrational human beings are. And something about that growing field struck us at RARE. And we said, look, ultimately, if we're talking about humans being the most important creature on planet Earth from a conservation standpoint, if understanding human nature is the smartest thing we can do as environmentalists, then this is all going to be about culture, because culture is about how we live together, and it's about how we self-identify, and it's about how we compare with others. And ultimately, and I can save you a PhD in behavioral economics and social psychology and neuroscience and evolutionary biology, simply by saying people change when they see other people change. That's why culture is so powerful. What is the culture? How do people do things? How do people make decisions? We notice keenly. We are keenly aware, even if it's not conscious. We are keenly aware of what those around us are doing and saying, what they're wearing, what they're driving. Behavior is highly contagious because we're Homo sapiens, because we're primates. So deep down, we know people change when they see other people change. We know that people change when they think other people expect them to change. And we know that people accelerate change when they believe change is accelerating. I like to say that this comes back to the savannah, the early days of humanity. And it's not hard to watch a show about planet Earth on your local streaming service and see at some point this moment where there's a whole bunch of animals calmly, lovingly making community on the savannah. They're feeding, they're nursing, they're wallowing. But then a small group of them get alert and stand up, the eyes get wide, the ears perk, and they take off. And even if only 5 of them take off, 1,000 might sprint right after them. What does that say about our animal nature? When we notice people around us are starting to fish differently, we change. We learned that in the Philippines and in Indonesia and in Mozambique. When we see farmers watching other farmers in Colombia start to compost, start to replant the habitat along their rivers, start to ring fence their 1 or 2 cattle on their 2 hectares of land, we see others recognizing there's a signal that people have started to do something different. That's the power of influencers. That's the power of social media. That's how marketing works. That's why word of mouth is way more cost effective than buying Super Bowl ads. An advertiser will never tell you that because they want to sell the Super Bowl ad. But what we know is if we can create the sense that people are starting to change, people change. So how do we create the sense that people are buying more sustainably, that people are driving electric vehicles, that people are charging them with solar panels, that people are being more conscientious about their diets, that we're not judging anybody, we're just laying out the facts. 5 or 6% of homeowners in the United States now own an electric vehicle. 5% or 6% of homeowners now in the United States have rooftop solar. Well, that's up from 0 a handful of years ago. That's a trend. How steep is that trend? Now you have Inflation Reduction Act and all the battles that will ensue over the next 4 years over energy rebates and inducements economically. But I would say we have those economic incentives and inducements. Can we invest in culture to match so that we're not only assuming humans make decisions based on their checkbooks, but that we're recognizing and we're smart enough to be self-aware enough to know we are really social, and what each of us does ripples out into our communities.
Brett, let's zoom into some of the specifics that you're learning about in terms of people's current behaviors and what's able to change, what they're willing to change, and the barriers. Last year, you partnered with Meta and the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications on a study on pro-climate behaviors, looking at adoption patterns as well as barriers across 37 high-income, high-emission countries. It's really a substantial study, and we'll include a link to it in the show notes. But give us a short summary of some of the key findings around what's holding people back and what needs to change.
Bottom line is there's a lot of awareness in some parts of the world about climate change, and there's a gross lack of awareness in some countries, and especially some of the world's poorest countries. Surprisingly to me, even some of the countries that are most impacted by climate change actually had very low public recognition of the phenomenon. And that may be because there's just so many other challenges related to survival of children that higher on the list. Literacy would have something to do with it as well. But so there's a great discrepancy in several ways between rich countries and poor countries in terms of not necessarily willingness, because once the concept was introduced in poor countries, everybody sort of said, yes, seen it, feeling it, yes, that's happening. I think of the research that we've done, one of the research that our partners and friends and colleagues have done, one of the most interesting studies I've seen in the last 5 years was done by a professor at Boston College who was doing his postdoc at Stanford, on Stanford's campus. His name is Dr. Greg Sparkman, and he invented a new term called dynamic norms. The study and essentially the story goes as follows. He stood on campus outside a cafe in Palo Alto, and he offered people a $5 voucher to have a conversation with him before, or one of his researchers, before they went in to order lunch and sit down and eat. And the $5 voucher was a way to induce them to talk to him, of course, this was $5 worth of currency. It let him track what people eventually decided to order after they had these conversations. There was a control conversation that talked about some basic facts about food consumption in America. And then in the experimental group, people were presented with the idea that 30% of Americans are starting to eat less meat. And just that notion, think about the gazelles or antelope or whatever you were imagining on the savannah. Think about when those first 5% take off and everybody sprints away from the feared predator. Well, just by hearing, walking into a cafeteria, the note, 30% of Americans are starting to eat less meat. Those people ordered 50% less meat in the lunch within the next 5 or 10 minutes of having that conversation. That gives me real hope for our ability to influence each other just by articulating what's actually happening and what people are willing and starting to do.
Brett, let's turn to a final question, which is about collaboration. Your organization recently published the Roadmap for Collective Action. It's a really robust document, over 100 pages of guidance for building effective multi-stakeholder collaborations. And again, we will link to that in the show notes. But given the scale and urgency of the problems that you're taking on, no matter how effective you are, of course, you're just one organization. And so really curious to hear, what do you see happening at that collaborative level? What's exciting to you and what do you think needs to change for accelerating progress?
I mean, I think you said it. We are facing catastrophic existential risks, whether you're talking about the 6th great species extinction caused entirely by humans or this dramatic shift in the Earth's climate. And so we are at Rare, we're one organization. So we end up partnering with others all the time across the board, partnering with Rivian on electrification, partnering with Netflix on supporting creators so that they can be more impactful with scripts and with characters, partnering with mayors across the global South, partnering with governments, no matter who's in office, and then, of course, partnering with other kinds of organizations. And so really what that collective roadmap outlines is a way of getting beyond your own institution to think about the nature of the problem, the nature of the people who represent the solution, how to meet those people where they are, and then how to create the kind of workflow and the kind of collaboration that prioritizes getting those specific outcomes. I wouldn't want to leave people with the trite impression that all we really need is for NGOs to come together, and any NGO worth their salt is already partnering in myriad ways. The only headache for NGOs partnering is you have 2 poor organizations struggling to raise money, and you end up with little conflicts left and right. That's inevitable, and it happens almost all the time. If you discount that, take that away, we all need to do way better in finding common ground, especially right now, and finding ways to work like with the recognition that the problem's way bigger than any of us. So not to speak in platitudes, but this one certainly is.
Brett, thank you so much for your time today and for all the work that you're doing. Sending you all the best wishes and best luck for a lot of continued progress.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Invested in Climate. Please remember to rate us on Apple, Spotify, or Google. Find show notes, sign up for updates, get in touch, and visualize your climate action at investedinclimate.com. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, accounting, or legal advice. Thanks again.